The text message from my mother glowed on my phone screen. Eleanor, we need to use your beach house for the summer. Your sister Lisa's kids deserve a nice vacation, and you're always working anyway. I stared at those words, my coffee growing, cold beside my laptop as I sat in my home office overlooking the Pacific. 3 years had passed since the family gathering where my father had casually remarked, "We just connect with Lisa's children differently. It's natural to have favorites, Eleanor." Now they needed something from me, the beach house I had purchased. Entirely on my own after years of careful saving and career sacrifices they'd never bothered to acknowledge. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I had always been the practical daughter, while my younger sister Lisa floated through life on a cloud of charm and spontaneity. I built my career methodically, brick by determined brick. Our childhood photos told the story clearly. Lisa in princess dresses and dance recital costumes, me in sensible clothes with a book tucked under my arm. Our parents, Martin and Diane Bennett, well-respected professors at the local university, had never tried to hide their preference for Lisa's vivacious personality and artistic tendencies. "Eleanor is our little adult," my mother would say whenever I solved my own problems or helped with household tasks. It wasn't intended as a compliment. It was an observation that I didn't need the attention, the encouragement, or the emotional support that was lavished on Lisa. I was self-sufficient, so I was left to be self-sufficient. When Lisa married young, at 23 to her college sweetheart Ryan, our parents threw an elaborate wedding at their New England home, spending what I later learned was most of their savings. 2 years later, when I announced my engagement to Thomas, a fellow accountant I'd met at my firm, my mother suggested a simple ceremony. "You're both so practical," she'd said. "You wouldn't want something extravagant." We ended up paying for our own modest wedding. Lisa's first child, Sophia, arrived a year after her wedding, followed quickly by twins Max and Emma. Each birth was celebrated with weeks of my parents' undivided attention. They rearranged work schedules, took leave from their teaching positions, and essentially moved in with Lisa to help with the newborns. When I had my daughter, Abigail, 4 years ago, my mother visited for 3 days before explaining she couldn't stay longer because Lisa needs help with the kids' science fair projects. I never complained. I had built a life that didn't depend on their approval or assistance. Thomas and I both had successful careers in financial management. We had purchased our primary home in Seattle, set up college funds for Abigail, and 2 years ago, fulfilled my long-held dream of buying a beach house in Cannon Beach, Oregon, a charming coastal town with a magnificent view of Haystack Rock. The beach house represented more than just a vacation property. It was tangible proof that I had succeeded on my own terms. The family dynamics reached a breaking point 3 years ago at my parents' 45th wedding anniversary celebration. Lisa arrived late with her 3 children, who immediately commandeered the event with their demands for attention and special food that hadn't been prepared. While my parents scrambled to accommodate them, Abigail sat quietly drawing in her sketchbook, occasionally showing me her pictures without interrupting the adults. "Abigail is so well behaved," my Aunt Carol remarked to my father. "She's such a good little girl." My father glanced at Abigail and then at Lisa's children, who were now arguing loudly over a game. "She's very quiet," he acknowledged, before adding the words that would echo in my mind for years to come. "But we just connect with Lisa's children differently. It's natural to have favorites, Eleanor. Sophia, Max, and Emma are more expressive. They need us more." The room didn't fall. Silent. No dramatic confrontation ensued. Life simply continued around us as my father took a sip of his champagne and moved on to greet another guest, unaware of the impact of his casual cruelty. I felt Thomas's hand on my shoulder, steadying me, as Abigail looked up with her innocent, brown eyes too young to understand but somehow sensing my distress. That night, as Thomas drove us back to our hotel, I finally allowed the tears to come. "He didn't mean it the way it sounded," Thomas offered. "Always the peacemaker." "He meant exactly what he said," I replied, watching the streetlights blur through my tears. They've always favored Lisa and her children. I've just never heard them admit it so plainly. After that night, I created some distance between myself and my parents. Our interactions became less frequent and more superficial. I stopped seeking their approval or hoping for equal treatment. Instead, I focused on my own family unit, Thomas, Abigail, and our life together. I poured my energy into my career, eventually becoming a partner at my firm. The beach house became our sanctuary, a place where we built our own traditions and memories, free from the shadow of familial favoritism. I maintained civil relations with my parents and Lisa, sending birthday gifts to my niece and nephews, attending major family events, and making obligatory holiday calls. But I no longer expected anything resembling fairness or recognition. It was a painful acceptance, but also liberating. By the time Abigail started kindergarten, I had found a new equilibrium, one that protected both my daughter and myself from the subtle wounds of being second best. Lisa's life, meanwhile, took a different trajectory. Ryan's software startup failed in its second year, leaving them financially strained. They moved to a smaller house, and Lisa, who had never finished her degree, struggled to find work that accommodated her children's schedules. My parents helped as much as they could, babysitting regularly and contributing financially when possible. I observed these developments with detached sympathy, refusing to feel resentment toward my sister or her children, who were innocent in all this. And then, last Tuesday morning, as I prepared for an important client meeting, my mother's text message arrived, so casually presumptuous that I had to read it twice. "Eleanor, we need to use your beach house for the summer. Your sister Lisa's kids deserve a nice vacation, and you're always working anyway." I didn't respond to my mother's message immediately. Instead, I set my phone face down on my desk, finished preparing for my meeting, and drove to the office. The presumption in her words needed to be processed, and I'd learned long ago that making decisions while emotional rarely ended well. The beach house had been my dream for over a decade. During my 20s, while Lisa was getting married and starting her family, I was working 60-hour weeks, taking on extra consulting projects and investing carefully. Thomas and I had lived in a modest apartment for the first 5 years of our marriage, saving diligently for our future. When we finally purchased the beach house 2 years ago, a charming 3-bedroom cottage with weathered blue siding and panoramic ocean views, it represented not just a vacation property, but a testament to my perseverance. The first time we brought Abigail there, she had run excitedly from room to room before dashing out to the wraparound porch. "Mommy, it's like a house from my storybooks," she had exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. That weekend, we had collected seashells, built sandcastles, and watched the sunset paint Haystack Rock in golden hues. It became our special place, a haven where Thomas, Abigail, and I could escape the pressures of daily life and simply be together. When I'd told my parents about the purchase, their response had been lukewarm at best. "That seems extravagant, Eleanor," my mother had said. "Couldn't you just rent places when you want to vacation?" My father had merely nodded in agreement, adding, "I hope this doesn't mean you'll be putting in fewer hours at work. Advancement requires dedication, you know." Neither of them had ever visited the beach house, despite standing invitations. Now they wanted to use it as if it were community property, specifically for Lisa's family. By lunchtime, I had successfully presented to my clients but found myself distracted during the post-meeting discussions. My colleague Vanessa noticed my preoccupation as we grabbed coffee afterward. "Everything okay? You seemed a million miles away after we wrapped up," she said, stirring her latte. I hesitated before showing her my mother's text. Vanessa had become a close friend over the years, one of the few people who knew the full history of my family dynamics. She read the message twice, her eyebrows rising. Wow, that's bold. It's typical, I replied. They've always assumed that Lisa's needs, and by extension her children's needs, take priority over mine. What are you going to do? Vanessa asked, handing back my phone. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to say no on principle. It's our sanctuary, not a free resort for my sister's family. But another part feels petty for even hesitating. It's just a house, after all. Vanessa considered this. Is it, though? From everything you've told me, this beach house represents years of work and sacrifice, things your parents and sister have never fully acknowledged or appreciated. She was right. The beach house was more than wood and glass. It was a symbol of my life choices and the independence I had built for myself and my family. That evening, I discussed the situation with Thomas over dinner after Abigail had gone to bed. As always, he listened patiently, asking occasional questions, but mostly letting me work through my thoughts aloud. Your mother didn't even phrase it as a request, he noted. It was a statement of intent. Exactly, I said, pushing my barely touched pasta around my plate, as if they have some right to it. And that comment about me always working, as if my career is some character flaw rather than what's allowed us to afford this life. Thomas reached across the table and took my hand. What do you want to do, Elle? This is your decision. I'll support whatever you choose. I squeezed his hand, gratefully. Thomas had always been my anchor, understanding the complexity of my family relationships without judging. He had witnessed the subtle slights over the years, the pattern of my parents consistently prioritizing Lisa's family while taking my stability for granted. I think I need more information, I finally said. Why this summer specifically? How long are they expecting to stay? Would they respect our rules about the property? I called my mother the next morning before work, bracing myself for the conversation. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright with the familiar tone she used when she wanted something. Eleanor? I was wondering when you'd call back. Did you get my message about the beach house? I did, I replied evenly. I'd like to understand. What exactly you're asking for, Mom? Oh, it's not complicated. Lisa and Ryan are struggling financially. You know his business went under. And the kids have been so disappointed about not having a proper summer vacation for the past 2 years. When I mentioned your beach house, they got so excited. We thought they could stay there for July and August, maybe even through Labor Day if you're not using it. 2 full months, possibly more. I felt a knot form in my stomach. We had already planned our own beach weekends throughout the summer, and Thomas had scheduled 2 full weeks off in August, our first extended family vacation in years. Actually, we do have plans to use the house this summer, I said. We've had it scheduled for months. There was a pause. Then my mother's voice took on an edge of disappointment. Surely not for the entire summer. You and Thomas work so much, Eleanor. The children would make full use of it. They deserve some happiness, after everything they've been through. There it was again. The implication that Lisa's children deserved special consideration, that their happiness was somehow more important than mine or Abigail's. That familiar ache of being second best spread through my chest. Our plans aren't negotiable, I said firmly. We've arranged time off work specifically to spend at the beach house. I took a deep breath before continuing. But I'd be open to discussing specific weeks when we won't be using it, if Lisa and her family want to visit then. My mother's sigh was audible. That's not really what we had in mind. The whole point was for them to have the run of the place, for the summer. A few scattered weeks wouldn't give them the same experience. It's the best I can offer, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The beach house is important to us too, Mom. Abigail is looking forward to our time there. I see, my mother replied, her tone cooling. Well, I'll tell Lisa. But I have to say, Eleanor, I'm disappointed. This is about family helping families. Your niece and nephews haven't had the advantages Abigail has. I bit back the retort that sprang to my lips, that any advantages Abigail had were the direct result of Thomas's and my hard work, not some cosmic unfairness. Instead, I simply said, let me know which weeks might work for them, and I'll check. Our schedule. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen counter, hands wrapped around my coffee mug, feeling that familiar mixture of guilt and resentment. My parents had always wielded guilt like a precision instrument, particularly when it came to my relationship with Lisa and her children. The implication was always the same. Because I had built financial stability, I owed it to my sister to compensate for her lack thereof. But this time, something felt different. Perhaps it was the accumulation of years of similar interactions, or perhaps it was the particularly brazen nature of this request, but I found myself unwilling to capitulate as I might have in the past. The beach house was mine, a symbol of my choices, my work ethic, my priorities. Allowing my sister's family to commandeer it for an entire summer felt like surrendering something essential about myself. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Your father says you're being selfish. The children were counting on this. And there it was, the hammer dropping, the accusation designed to make me fall in line. I stared at the words, feeling a strange sense of clarity wash over me. This wasn't really about the beach house at all. It was about the same dynamic that had defined our family for decades, the expectation that I would always be the one to give in, to accommodate, to sacrifice. Not this time. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. That evening, I searched through my desk drawer for a leather-bound notebook my grandmother had given me before she passed away. Inside were various important documents, the deed to the beach house, insurance papers, our wills. I needed to remind myself that this property was legally mine, purchased with my earnings, maintained with my resources. No matter how much guilt my parents tried to heap upon me, they had no claim to it. Thomas found me at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out before me, a glass of red wine half empty at my elbow. Battle plans? He asked gently, sliding into the chair beside me. I managed a small smile. Just reminding myself of some facts. The beach house is in both our names. We pay the taxes, the insurance, the maintenance. We've never received a dime of help from my parents. You don't have to convince me, he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. Or yourself, for that matter. You have every right to say no. Then, why do I feel so guilty? I asked, running my finger along the edge of the deed. Why do I still hear that voice in my head telling me I'm being selfish, that I should just give in for the sake of family harmony? Thomas considered this. Because that's the role you've been assigned since childhood, the responsible one who makes sacrifices. It's a hard pattern to break. Lisa never seems to feel guilty about anything, I mused. She just expects people to accommodate her. Different roles, different expectations, Thomas replied. Your parents trained Lisa to receive and you to give. Breaking that pattern feels wrong because it goes against everything you've been conditioned to do. The next morning, I received 3 missed calls from my sister while in a meeting. As I walked back to my office, I listened to her voicemail. Eleanor, Mom told me you're being difficult about the beach house. I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. The kids have been through so much with Ryan's business, failing and having to move to a smaller house. They deserve something nice this summer. Call me back so we can sort this out. Her tone was a mixture of entitlement and exasperation, as if my resistance was an inconvenient obstacle rather than a legitimate boundary. I placed my phone face down on my desk, just as I had with my mother's text, and focused on completing my work for the day. During my lunch break, I called my Aunt Carol, my father's sister, and the only relative who had ever seemed to understand my position in the family dynamic. She had been the one to notice Abigail's good behavior at my parents' anniversary party, the one who occasionally sent me supportive texts when she witnessed particularly blatant examples of favoritism. "I'm not surprised," she said after I explained the situation. "Your parents have always had a blind spot when it comes to the imbalance between how they treat you and Lisa, but this request crosses a line." "Does it?" I asked, still uncertain. "Part of me wonders if I'm overreacting. It's just a house after all." "Eleanor?" Aunt Carol's voice was firm. "It's not just a house. It's a symbol of your hard work and independence. More importantly, this is about respect. They're not respecting your property, your plans, or your boundaries. You're allowed to say no." Her validation eased some of the tension I'd been carrying. "Lisa called me this morning acting like I'm being unreasonable." "Of course she did. She's always gotten what she wants from your parents, so why would she expect something different from you?" Aunt Carol paused. "Can I ask you something? If the situation were reversed, if Lisa owned a beach house and you wanted to use it for the summer, would she let you?" The question caught me off guard, but the answer was immediately clear. "No," I said with certainty. "She'd say she needed it for herself." "Exactly. You've spent your whole life making allowances for Lisa that she would never make for you. Maybe it's time to stop." After we hung up, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Aunt Carol was right. This wasn't about being selfish or unkind. It was about establishing a boundary that should have been established long ago. I called Lisa back that afternoon, preparing myself for the conversation. "Finally," she answered, irritation evident in her voice. "Have you reconsidered your position on the beach house?" "Hello to you too, Lisa," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I understand you've talked to Mom about using our beach house this summer." "Yes, and I don't understand why you're being so difficult about it. The kids are really looking forward to it." "I'm sorry that Mom led you to believe it would be available. She didn't consult with me before making that assumption. As I told her, Thomas and I have our own plans for using the house this summer, including 2 weeks in August that Thomas has already taken off work." Lisa made a dismissive sound. "Surely you could reschedule. Or maybe you could use it in September, after the kids are back in school. They really need this, Eleanor. You know how tough things have been for us financially." I took a deep breath. "I understand things have been difficult, and I'm happy to work with you on finding weeks when the house is available. But we won't be changing our own vacation plans." "That's not good enough?" Lisa's voice rose. "The whole point was for them to have an extended stay, to really enjoy the summer at the beach. A few scattered weeks is meaningless." "It's what I can offer," I said, echoing my words to my mother. "God, you've always been so selfish," Lisa snapped. "Just because you've been successful financially doesn't mean you have to lord it over the rest of us. Some of us have made different life choices." The accusation stung, but it also crystallized something for me. Yes, we've all made choices, Lisa. I chose to work 60-hour weeks through my 20s so I could afford things like the beach house. You chose a different path. Neither is wrong, but my choices don't obligate me to provide you with the fruits of my labor. Is that what this is about? You resent me because Mom and Dad helped me more? That's not my fault, Eleanor. You can't punish my children for that. This isn't about punishment, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. It's about respecting that the beach house is my property, purchased with my earnings, and that I have the right to decide how and when it's used. You've changed, Lisa said, her voice cold. You used to care about your family. I still do, I replied. But caring about family doesn't mean letting myself be taken advantage of. My offer stands. Let me know which specific weeks you'd like to use the house, and I'll check if they're available. Don't bother. She hung up abruptly. I sat at my desk, shaking slightly. Standing up to Lisa felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I had spent decades carefully navigating around her expectations, making accommodations, accepting less. This simple act of saying no was revolutionary. That evening, my father called. Unlike my mother and sister, he rarely involved himself directly in our disputes, preferring to remain above the fray. The fact that he was calling now indicated just how seriously they were taking my resistance. "Eleanor." His voice was measured, professorial, the tone he used when delivering lectures. "Your mother tells me you're refusing to help your sister out this summer." "That's not accurate, Dad," I replied. "I've offered specific weeks when the beach house is available. What I've refused is to cancel my own family's plans or to give them the entire summer. You know Lisa's situation is difficult right now. The children have been quite affected by the financial downturn. I understand that, and I sympathize. But I fail to see why that means my family should cancel our own vacation plans." His sigh was audible. "Eleanor, family means supporting each other. Your sister needs this more than you do." There it was again, the familiar refrain. Lisa needs it more. Lisa deserves it more. I closed my eyes, steeling myself. Dad, Thomas, and I have worked incredibly hard for what we have. We've made sacrifices, saved diligently, created opportunities for ourselves. The beach house represents years of that effort. I'm willing to share it at times that don't conflict with our own plans. But I won't cancel our family vacation to accommodate Lisa's. "I'm disappointed in you," he said finally. "I thought we raised you to be more generous, more understanding." "You raised me to be responsible," I countered. "To work hard, to save, to plan ahead. That's exactly what I've done. And now I'm being asked to set that aside because Lisa hasn't done the same." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Finally, my father spoke again. "We'll continue this discussion another time. Your mother and I need to help Lisa figure out an alternative for the children's summer." After he hung up, I sank onto the couch, emotionally drained. The conversation had confirmed what I'd always suspected, but never fully acknowledged. In my parents' eyes, my responsibility and self-sufficiency weren't virtues to be rewarded, but resources to be tapped for Lisa's benefit. For the first time, I had refused to play my assigned role. And while it hurt to face my parents' disappointment, I also felt something else. A growing sense of self-respect, of standing firm in my own worth. The beach house wasn't just a property anymore. It had become the battleground for a much larger conflict, one about fairness, boundaries, and the right to enjoy the fruits of my own labor without guilt. The next week passed in a tense silence. No more calls from my parents, no texts from Lisa. I tried to focus on work, on Abigail, on the daily rhythms of our life, but the confrontation lingered in the background of my thoughts like static electricity, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. On Friday, Thomas suggested we drive to the beach house for the weekend. "Let's remind ourselves why we love it so much," he said, his eyes gentle with understanding. "Plus, it'll be good for Abigail to run around on the beach after being cooped up with that cold all week." The idea was perfect. I needed to reconnect with the joy the beach house brought us, to remember why I had worked so hard to make it a reality. Early Saturday morning, we packed the car and headed west toward the coast, Abigail chattering excitedly in the back seat about collecting seashells and building the biggest sandcastle ever. As we drove through the small coastal towns, past cedar-shingled cottages and weathered coastal pines, I felt the tension begin to ease from my shoulders. The further we got from Seattle, the smaller my family drama seemed. By the time we caught our first glimpse of the Pacific, sparkling silver blue under the spring sunshine, I was breathing more easily than I had all week. We rounded the final bend in the road, and our beach house came into view. The weathered blue siding, the white trim, the wraparound porch where we liked to watch the sunset. But something was different. An unfamiliar car was parked in the driveway. "Are you expecting someone?" Thomas asked, slowing our vehicle. I shook my head, a knot forming in my stomach. As we pulled into the driveway behind the strange car, the front door of our house opened, and my mother stepped onto the porch. My breath caught. Behind her, I could see movement inside the house, the unmistakable shapes of children darting past the windows. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered as we parked. Abigail unbuckled herself from her car seat. "Grandma's here," she exclaimed, innocent, of the tension suddenly electrifying the air. I stepped out of the car, legs unsteady with shock and emerging anger. "Mom, what are you doing here? How did you get in?" My mother smiled as if this were a normal visit, as if she hadn't essentially broken into our vacation home. "Eleanor, what a surprise! We didn't expect you until summer." "We," I echoed as Lisa appeared in the doorway, her twins peeking around her legs. "We wanted to check out the house, see what we'd need to bring for summer," my mother explained, her tone breezy but her eyes watchful. Lisa had a long weekend from work, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity. I stared at her in disbelief. "How did you get in?" I repeated. My mother at least had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "You remember when you had that plumbing issue last year? You gave your father a key so he could let the plumber in while you were at work. We kept a copy." The violation hit me like a physical blow. They had kept a key to our house without our knowledge or permission. They had let themselves in, brought Lisa and her children, all after I had explicitly refused to give them the full summer access. Thomas stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on my back. "Diane," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this is inappropriate. We never gave you permission to keep a key or to use the house without our knowledge." Lisa emerged fully onto the porch, arms crossed defensively. "It's not like you were using it. And the kids were so excited about seeing the beach." Abigail had climbed out of the car and was now standing beside me, her small hand slipping into mine. "Mommy?" she questioned, sensing the tension. "Why is Aunt Lisa at our beach house?" The simple question from my daughter crystallized everything. This was our beach house, mine, Thomas's, and Abigail's. Our sanctuary, purchased with our money, filled with our memories. And my family had invaded it without permission, disregarding our boundaries as if they didn't exist, as if our ownership was merely theoretical. "Lisa? Mom?" I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need you to pack up and leave. Now." My mother's eyes widened. "Eleanor, don't be dramatic. We're family. And we're already here, so why don't we all just enjoy the weekend together?" "Because you didn't ask," Thomas replied before I could. "You used a key that you kept without our permission, entered our property without our knowledge, and brought guests after Eleanor explicitly told you the house wasn't available for extended use." "We were just trying to," Lisa began, but I cut her off. "I don't care what you were just trying to do. This is our property, and you have no right to be here without our permission." My mother's expression hardened. "I've never seen this side of you, Eleanor. So possessive, so unwilling to share. What happened to the generous daughter I raised?" The familiar guilt tactic washed over me, but this time it didn't land. Instead, it fueled a righteous anger I'd been suppressing for years. "What happened?" I repeated. "What happened is that I grew up watching you and Dad give Lisa everything while I was expected to be satisfied with less. I grew up being told that my responsibility and self-sufficiency were reasons to expect less support, less attention, less consideration. I grew up believing that my needs and wants would always come second to Lisa's. But I'm an adult now, with my own family, my own property, and my own boundaries. And I'm done accepting less." A stunned silence followed my outburst. Even Thomas looked surprised by my vehemence. Abigail squeezed my hand, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, to modulate my tone for her sake. "I need you to leave," I repeated more calmly. "We'll talk about this another time, but right now I want to enjoy my weekend with my husband and daughter in our house. Lisa glared at me. Fine, we'll go. But don't expect us to forget this, Eleanor. The kids are heartbroken. I'm sorry the children are disappointed, I said sincerely. But that's not on me. It's on you and Mom for making promises about property that isn't yours. It took them almost an hour to pack up and leave. The atmosphere was glacial as they gathered swimsuits, beach toys, and the groceries they'd brought. My mother tried once more to convince me to let them stay. Just for tonight, Eleanor, it's getting late. But I remained firm. As they drove away, Abigail looked up at me with confusion. Why was Grandma mad? And why did they have to leave? I knelt down to my daughter's eye level, searching for words that would help her understand without burdening her with the full complexity of adult relationships. Sometimes, honey, even people who love each other need to have clear boundaries. Grandma and Aunt Lisa came to our house without asking, and that's not okay. Just like you wouldn't want someone to take your toys without asking, right? She nodded. Solemnly. They should have asked first. Exactly, I said, smoothing her hair. Now, who wants to go build that sandcastle you've been talking about? Her face brightened instantly, childhood resilience in action. Me. Can we go right now? As Abigail raced to her room to change into her swimsuit, Thomas pulled me into a hug. I'm proud of you, he murmured into my hair. That couldn't have been easy. I leaned into his embrace, suddenly exhausted. It wasn't. Part of me still feels guilty, like I'm the unreasonable one. You're not, he assured me. What they did crossed a major line. You had every right to ask them to leave. I nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his unwavering support. I just hope this doesn't create a permanent rift in the family. Thomas pulled back slightly to look at me. If it does, that's on them, not you. You've been more than accommodating for years. It's about time they learned that your generosity has limits. Later that afternoon, as I watched Abigail and Thomas building an elaborate sandcastle at the water's edge, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Sadness that my relationship with my parents and sister had reached this point, anger at their presumption and disrespect. But underneath it all was something new, a quiet, steady confidence in my right to set boundaries, to expect respect, to protect what was mine without guilt or apology. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my father. Your mother is very upset. We need to discuss this as a family. Call us when you get home. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without responding. For now, I would focus on the weekend with my family. My real family, the one I had built with love and trust and mutual respect. The one that didn't require me to diminish myself to make room for others. The difficult conversations could wait. This moment, Abigail's delighted laughter as a wave threatened their sandcastle, Thomas's protective arm around her small shoulders, the sun warm on my face. This belonged to us, and I refused to let it be tainted by guilt or obligation. For the first time in my life, I was claiming what was mine without apology. And it felt like freedom. Despite my determination to enjoy our weekend at the beach house, the confrontation cast a shadow over our time there. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks, glancing nervously at the driveway whenever a car passed by. Thomas noticed. Of course, he always did. They're not coming back, he assured me as we sat on the porch Sunday morning, watching Abigail hunt for shells at the edge of the water. Not this weekend, anyway. I know, I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. The brazenness of their intrusion had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I just can't believe they thought it was acceptable to make a copy of our key and let themselves in. It's the entitlement that's so stunning, Thomas agreed, refilling my coffee cup. The assumption that what's yours is theirs to use at will, I nodded, watching as Abigail triumphantly held up a sand dollar she'd discovered. I've been thinking about changing the locks. Already scheduled for Tuesday, Thomas replied with a small smile. Called a locksmith yesterday while you were making dinner. I leaned over to kiss him, grateful not for the first time that I had chosen a partner who understood boundaries and respected mine. Have I mentioned lately that I love you? You could stand to mention it more often, he teased. We managed to salvage most of the weekend, building sandcastles with Abigail, grilling fresh seafood on the deck, and taking long walks along the shoreline. By Sunday afternoon, I had almost pushed the incident to the back of my mind. Almost. The drive back to Seattle that evening was quiet, with Abigail dozing in her car seat, clutching the collection of shells she'd insisted on bringing home. As we merged onto the highway, Thomas glanced over at me. "Are you ready for the fallout?" he asked gently. I sighed, staring out at the darkening landscape. Not really. But it's inevitable, isn't it? I've changed the rules of engagement and they're not going to accept that quietly. Probably not, he agreed. But I'm with you, whatever comes next. We arrived home to find 3 voicemails from my father and 5 texts from my mother, each more urgent than the last. I set my phone aside without responding and focused on getting Abigail bathed and tucked into bed. Tomorrow would be soon enough to deal with the family crisis I had precipitated. Monday morning brought a barrage of new messages, including one from Lisa that was just a single line. "Thanks for ruining my kid's weekend. Hope you're happy." I deleted it without responding and headed to work, grateful for the distraction of client meetings and financial analyses. Numbers were so much more straightforward than family dynamics. They balanced or they didn't. No emotional manipulation required. Vanessa cornered me at lunch, her expression concerned. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Didn't the weekend go well?" I gave her a brief summary of finding my mother, sister, and niece and nephews at our beach house, watching her eyes widen with each detail. "They made a copy of your key without permission?" she repeated, incredulous. "That's not just presumptuous, it's actually illegal." I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but she was right. I was so focused on the boundary violation that I didn't even consider the legal implications. "Well, you're changing the locks, right?" Thomas already arranged it. "Locksmith is coming tomorrow." She nodded approvingly. "Good. And what about the family fallout? Are you going to call them back?" I pushed my salad around with my fork and my appetite diminished. "Eventually, I'm just gathering my strength first." "That's understandable," Vanessa said, "but don't let it drag on too long. The longer you avoid it, the more they'll spin narratives about your unreasonableness in their heads." She was right, of course. By avoiding the confrontation, I was giving my parents and Lisa time to solidify their position, to frame me as the villain in this family drama. It was time to take control of the narrative. That evening, after Abigail was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table with Thomas and drafted a carefully worded email to my parents and Lisa. I chose email deliberately. I wanted a record of what was said, and I needed to express myself without interruption or manipulation. "Dear Mom, Dad, and Lisa," I wrote, "I'm writing to address what happened this weekend at our beach house. To be clear, entering our property without explicit permission, especially after using a key that was copied without our knowledge, was a serious violation of our boundaries and trust. It was not acceptable, and it cannot happen again. I understand that you believe family resources should be shared, but the beach house is not a family resource. It is a private property that Thomas and I purchased with our own earnings, maintained with our own funds, and have the right to use as we see fit. We have been clear about our summer plans and our unwillingness to give up the house for the entire season. However, I remain willing to coordinate specific dates when the house would be available for Lisa and her family to use. If you are interested in this option, please let me know, and we can discuss details, including expectations for how the property should be left and any contribution toward utilities during your stay. I value our family relationships, but they must be based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. What happened this weekend demonstrated neither, and it has damaged the trust between us. I hope we can move forward in a healthier way, but that requires acknowledgement of the inappropriate nature of your actions and a commitment to respecting our boundaries in the future. Eleanor, I read it to Thomas, who nodded his approval. It's firm but fair. You're stating your boundaries clearly while still leaving the door open for a relationship, just on different terms. Do you think they'll see it that way? I asked, my finger hovering over the send button. Honestly? Probably not, at least not initially. They've had decades of you accommodating their expectations. This is going to be a seismic shift for them. I pressed send before I could second-guess myself further, then shut my laptop with a definitive click. Well, it's done. The response came faster than I expected. Within an hour, my phone rang, my father calling. I let it go to voicemail, not ready for a direct confrontation. The message he left was terse. Eleanor, we need to discuss this in person, not through impersonal emails. Your mother is extremely upset. Call us. I didn't. Instead, I listened to the voicemail twice, noting the absence of any acknowledgement that what they had done was wrong. There was no apology, just the expectation that I would once again accommodate their feelings and prioritize my mother's distress over my own legitimate grievance. Lisa's response came via text. Are you seriously charging us to use your beach house? After all Mom and Dad have done for you over the years? Unbelievable. I showed Thomas the message, laughing despite myself at the absurdity. All they've done for me? They didn't even help us with the down payment on our first house, but they paid off Lisa's student loans twice after she dropped out and re-enrolled. They've done a masterful job of rewriting history, Thomas observed dryly. In their version, you're the ungrateful daughter who owes them, not the self-sufficient one who's never asked for anything. My mother's email arrived just before midnight. A lengthy diatribe about family obligations, generosity, and the heartbreak I was causing by being so rigid and selfish. Each paragraph dripped with emotional manipulation, designed to make me question my own perceptions and boundaries. We have always supported you, she wrote near the end, a claim so divorced from reality that I actually laughed out loud. All we're asking is that you show the same support to your sister and her children during this difficult time. Is that really too much to ask? I closed the email without responding, a strange calm settling over me. Their reactions were exactly as expected, dismissive of my boundaries, devoid of apology, heavy on guilt and manipulation. But for the first time, I could see the pattern clearly, and I was no longer susceptible to it. You don't have to respond. Right away, Thomas said, noticing my expression as I set aside my phone. Or at all, for that matter. I know, I replied. And I won't. Not until I'm ready. Not until they're ready to actually hear me, not just respond with more guilt trips. As I got ready for bed that night, I thought about Abigail, sleeping peacefully, down the hall. I wondered what lessons she would learn from watching this family drama unfold. Would she see a mother who finally stood up for herself, who refused to accept disrespect and boundary violations, even from her own parents? Or would she see relationships fractured beyond repair? I hoped for the former, but I was prepared for the latter if necessary. Because some lessons were worth teaching, even at great cost. The lesson that she deserved respect, that her boundaries mattered, that her needs and wants were valid, that was a legacy worth fighting for, even if it meant redefining or limiting. My relationship with my parents and sister. For the first time in my life, I was valuing myself the way I wanted my daughter to learn to value herself. And that felt like the most important parenting decision I had ever made. 3 days passed with no further communication from me, though the messages from my family continued to accumulate. I maintained my silence, focusing on work and my immediate family, gathering my strength for the inevitable confrontation. The locks at the beach house were changed on Tuesday as planned, and Thomas arranged for a security camera to be installed at the entrance, just as a precaution, he said, though we both knew it was more than that. On Thursday morning, my Aunt Carol called. "Your mother's been calling me nonstop," she said without preamble. "She's trying to recruit me to convince you to be reasonable about the beach house." "And?" I asked, tensing slightly. Carol had always been supportive, but family pressure could be a powerful force. And I told her I thought she and your father owed you an apology for violating your privacy and boundaries, she replied. I could hear the smile in her voice. She didn't take it well. Relief washed over me. Thank you for that. I was starting to feel like I was living in an alternate reality where making a copy of someone's house key without permission is perfectly normal. It's not normal, and you're not overreacting, Carol assured me. But Eleanor, I think you should know that this situation is escalating. Your parents are convinced you're having some sort of breakdown or midlife crisis. They're talking about some kind of intervention. Intervention? I repeated incredulously. Because I asked them to. Respect my property rights? I know it's absurd. But they've spent so many years viewing you through a particular lens, the adaptable, accommodating daughter who never makes waves, that they can't process this change. In their minds, something must be wrong with you, because the alternative is acknowledging that something has been wrong with their treatment of you for decades. Her insight hit me with the force of revelation. Of course, they would pathologize my boundary setting rather than examine their own behavior. That was the family pattern. Lisa's needs were legitimate and deserved accommodation. My needs were inconvenient disruptions to the established order. What kind of intervention are they planning? I asked, already dreading the answer. They want to have a family meeting this weekend. Your father called your cousin Michael, the therapist, to ask if he would mediate, I groaned. Michael was my father's nephew, professionally obligated to remain neutral, but personally enmeshed in the family system. Let me guess, they didn't tell Michael the whole story. I doubt it, Carol confirmed. You might want to reach out to him yourself, give him your perspective before the meeting. After we hung up, I called Thomas to update him on this new development. An intervention? He echoed, his tone mirroring my own disbelief. For enforcing basic property rights. Apparently standing up for myself qualifies as concerning behavior in my family, I said, trying to keep my voice light despite the anger building inside me. Aunt Carol thinks I should talk to Michael before the meeting. Good idea, Thomas agreed. He should have the full picture. But Eleanor, you don't have to attend this meeting at all if you don't want to. His reminder was like a breath of fresh air. I didn't have to participate in their narrative. I could refuse the meeting entirely and continue maintaining my boundaries from a distance. But a part of me knew that wouldn't resolve anything. The tension would continue to build, positions would harden, and any chance of a healthier relationship would slip away. If there was to be any path forward, I needed to face this directly. I think I do need to go, I said finally. But on my terms, not theirs, and you'll be with me. Always, Thomas promised. I called my cousin Michael that afternoon. He sounded relieved to hear from me. Uncle Martin called me about mediating some family discussion this weekend, he said. He was vague about the details, just mentioned concerns about you becoming distant and unreasonable lately. I was planning to call you anyway to get your perspective. I gave him a concise summary of the situation, my parents' lifelong pattern of favoring Lisa, the beach house request, their unauthorized entry using a copied key, and the subsequent fallout. There was a long silence when I finished. Finally, Michael said, Well, that's significantly different from the impression I was given. I'm sure it is, I replied dryly. Look, Eleanor, I need to be upfront with you. I don't think I should mediate this meeting. There are too many complex family dynamics at play, and I'm not an objective third party here. This family needs proper therapy with someone who isn't related to all of you. I wasn't surprised by his response, but I appreciated his honesty. I understand. I'll let my parents know. For what it's worth, he added before we hung up, maintaining boundaries isn't a sign of mental health problems. It's a sign of healthy self-respect. After our call, I texted my father. Michael won't be mediating any family meeting. If you and Mom want to talk, we can meet at our house Saturday afternoon. Thomas will be present. His response was immediate. This is a family issue. Thomas doesn't need to be involved. My reply was equally swift. Thomas is my family. Either he's included or there's no meeting. There was a long pause before my father's next message. Fine, 2 p.m. Saturday. I showed the exchange to Thomas when he got home that evening. Round one to you, he said, giving me a supportive squeeze. Setting the location and the participants, that's taking control of the narrative. I still don't know if anything will change, I admitted. They seem determined to see me as the problem. Probably, he agreed. But this isn't about changing them, Eleanor. It's about changing how you respond to them, and you're already doing that brilliantly. The next day at work, I found myself distracted, mentally rehearsing what I would say at the meeting. Vanessa noticed my preoccupation when I mixed up the numbers during our project review. Family stuff still weighing on you? She asked as we grabbed coffee afterward. I nodded, filling her in on the latest developments. An intervention? That's creative, she said, raising an eyebrow. But actually, I think this meeting could be good. It's an opportunity to reset expectations and establish new patterns. If they're willing to listen, I pointed out. Whether they listen or not isn't the point, Vanessa replied, stirring her latte thoughtfully. The point is that you're speaking your truth clearly, without apology. That changes things, even if the change isn't immediate or obvious. Her perspective helped settle my nerves. Regardless of my parents' and Lisa's reactions, this meeting was my opportunity to articulate boundaries that should have been established long ago. Saturday arrived with a weight of anticipation. Thomas and I spent the morning tidying the house and preparing simple refreshments, an automatic hospitality response that made me smile ruefully when I caught myself arranging cookies on a plate. Old habits, I murmured, and Thomas kissed the top of my head in understanding. It's okay to be generous and hospitable, he reminded me. The problem was never your giving nature. It was the one-way expectation that you would give while others would take. Abigail was spending the afternoon with a friend, a deliberate decision to shield her from the potential tension of the meeting. At precisely 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and went to let my parents in. They stood stiffly on the porch, my mother's lips pressed in a thin line, my father's expression carefully neutral. Behind them, unexpectedly, was Lisa. I didn't realize Lisa would be joining us, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. This concerns all of us, my father replied, his tone brooking no argument. I stepped back to let them enter, exchanging a quick glance with Thomas, who had appeared in the hallway. His slight nod reassured me. We would handle this together, whatever came. The battle lines were drawn. The long-overdue confrontation was about to begin. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to fight for what I deserved. Respect, boundaries, and recognition of my worth as something more than the family's reliable safety net. We gathered in the living room, an awkward tableau of family tension. Thomas had arranged the seating deliberately, 2 armchairs for us, facing the sofa where my parents and Lisa sat. The physical arrangement subtly reinforced that this was our home, our territory, not a neutral ground where old patterns could easily reassert themselves. My mother broke the silence first. Eleanor, we are very concerned about your behavior lately. This isn't like you. I took a measured breath. Which behavior specifically concerns you, Mom? Setting boundaries about my property? Expecting respect for my decisions? Don't be difficult, my father interjected. You know what we mean. This sudden hostility toward your family, this unwillingness to help your sister when she needs it, I haven't been hostile, I countered evenly. I've been clear about my boundaries, which isn't the same thing. And I did offer to help Lisa, just not in the exact way and to the exact extent that you demanded. Lisa scoffed, arms crossed tightly over her chest. A few scattered weeks at the beach house hardly counts as help. It's more than you're entitled to, Thomas said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since they arrived, and his calm statement seemed to surprise my parents. My mother's eyes narrowed. Thomas, with all due respect, this is a family matter. He is family, I stated firmly. My family. And this is our home, just as the beach house is our property. My father leaned forward, his professor demeanor in full force. Eleanor, we raised you to understand that families support each other. Your sister is going through a difficult time, and you have resources that could help. It's as simple as that. No, Dad, it's not that simple, I replied. This isn't about one request for the beach house. This is about a lifetime of uneven expectations. I've always been expected to accommodate, to understand, to give way. Lisa has always been expected to receive. Lisa rolled her eyes dramatically. Here we go with the martyr routine. Poor Eleanor, so burdened by being the responsible one. I've never minded being responsible, I said, meeting her gaze directly. What I've minded is having that responsibility exploited rather than appreciated. What I've minded is watching you receive constant support, financial and otherwise, while I was expected to manage on my own because I was capable. That's not fair, my mother protested. We've always been equally supportive of both of you. The absurdity of this claim nearly made me laugh. Mom, that's simply not true. You paid for Lisa's elaborate wedding. Thomas and I paid for our own. You helped with the down payment on Lisa's first house. We saved for years for ours. You've bailed Lisa out of financial problems repeatedly. We've never asked for or received similar help. Those were different circumstances, my father argued. Lisa needed, I echoed. That's always been the refrain, hasn't it? Lisa needed more help, more attention, more resources. Never a question of whether I might need those things too, because I was managing without them. My success became the justification for giving me less. An uncomfortable silence descended. Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand, a silent show of support that steadied me. My mother's voice was softer when she spoke again, her strategy shifting from confrontation to emotional appeal. Eleanor, sweetheart, we never meant to make you feel less important. We're proud of how capable and independent you've always been. That's a compliment, not a punishment. It doesn't feel like a compliment when it's used to justify giving me less, I replied. And it certainly doesn't feel like a compliment when you discount my feelings, dismiss my boundaries, and literally break into my property after I've said, no. We didn't break in, my father objected. We had a key. A key you copied without permission and kept without our knowledge, Thomas pointed out. That's not the same as being invited. Lisa shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Look, maybe we should have asked first, but the kids were so excited about seeing the beach. We didn't think you'd mind. That's exactly the problem, I said, seizing on her words. You didn't think you needed to ask. You assumed that what was mine was available for your use, because that's the pattern we've always had. My needs, my boundaries, my property are all secondary to yours. My father cleared his throat. Eleanor, I think you're making too much of this. It was a simple misunderstanding about the house. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Dad. A misunderstanding is when there's confusion about expectations. There was no confusion here. I explicitly said the house wasn't available for the entire summer. You and Mom and Lisa decided that my no wasn't valid or important enough to respect. We thought you were just being difficult, my mother admitted. That if we showed up, you'd realize how important this was to the children and reconsider. Her honesty was startling, an accidental revelation of their underlying assumption that my boundaries were negotiable, obstacles to be worked around rather than limits to be respected. Do you understand why that's a problem? I asked, genuinely, curious if they could see it. Do you understand why it's hurtful and disrespectful to assume that my clearly stated boundaries are just flexible inconveniences that you can ignore or overcome? My parents exchanged glances, a silent communication developed over decades of marriage. My father looked genuinely perplexed. Eleanor, families don't operate on rigid rules about property and boundaries. There's give and take. Flexibility. Yes, there should be give and take, I agreed. But in our family, I've done most of the giving, and Lisa has done most of the taking. That's not flexibility. That's an imbalance. Lisa stood abruptly. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. You've always been jealous of my relationship with Mom and Dad. Now you're using this beach house situation to punish all of us for some perceived childhood slight. This isn't about jealousy or punishment, I replied, maintaining my composure despite her outburst. This is about establishing healthier patterns going forward. I'm not asking for special treatment, just equal consideration and basic respect. Equal consideration? Lisa scoffed. You have everything, Eleanor. A successful career, financial stability, a perfect little family. Why can't you share some of that with your niece and nephews? Why do you have to be so selfish? The familiar accusation hung in the air. Selfish, the ultimate weapon in my family's arsenal, designed to make me question my own legitimacy, to make me fall back in line. But this time, I saw it clearly for what it was. Manipulation, not truth. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, I said quietly. Expecting respect isn't selfish. Having worked hard for what I have doesn't obligate me to give it away, especially not to people who can't even acknowledge that it's mine to give or withhold. My mother's eyes filled with tears, another familiar tactic. I don't recognize you anymore, Eleanor. You've changed. Yes, I agreed, feeling a strange sense of peace despite the tension. I have changed. I'm no longer willing to accept being treated as less important, less deserving of consideration, less entitled to my own boundaries and property. That change has been a long time coming. Thomas, who had been mostly silent, lending his support through his presence, spoke up. What Eleanor is asking for isn't unreasonable. She's not cutting you out of her life. She's not even refusing to share the beach house. She's simply asking for her boundaries to be respected, for her property rights to be acknowledged, and for some recognition that the family dynamic has been unbalanced. His calm, reasonable summary seemed to land differently than my more emotional statements. My father, particularly, appeared to be considering his words with new attention. The conversation had reached a crucial turning point. Would my family finally hear me? Or would they continue to cast me as the villain in their narrative, the selfish daughter who had inexplicably turned against them? A heavy silence filled the room after Thomas finished speaking. The air seemed to vibrate with unspoken emotions, hurt, confusion, anger, and perhaps, just perhaps, the first glimmer of understanding. My father was the first to break the silence. Eleanor, he began, his tone more measured than before, I think we need to take a step back. You've raised some points that deserve consideration. It wasn't an apology, or even an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it was a retreat from the offensive position he'd taken earlier. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. Perhaps, he said carefully, we have sometimes taken your self-sufficiency for granted. That wasn't our intention, but I can see how it might have felt that way to you. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. We've always been so proud of you, Eleanor. So proud of how capable and successful you've become. We never thought you needed the same kind of help Lisa did. But that's exactly the problem, I said gently, seeing an opening for genuine communication. You decided what I needed, or rather what I didn't need, without ever asking me. And over time, that became a pattern of treating Lisa's needs as legitimate and important, while treating mine as optional, secondary. My father's brow furrowed. I'm not sure that's entirely fair. Let me give you a concrete example, I said, shifting slightly in my chair. When Thomas and I were saving for our first house, we lived in that tiny one-bedroom apartment for 3 years to maximize our savings. During that same period, you helped Lisa and Ryan with the down payment on their house, even though they'd only been saving for a few months. They had Sophia by then, my mother interjected. They needed more space. I understand that, I acknowledged. But did it ever occur to you to offer us similar help? Not because we were desperate, but simply because it would have made our lives easier too? Would have let us start building equity sooner? Would have been an equal expression of support for both your daughters? My parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was clear from their expressions that no, it hadn't occurred to them. Or when Abigail was born, I continued, pressing the advantage while they seemed receptive. You visited for 3 days, Mom. When each of Lisa's children was born, you stayed for weeks. Did you ever ask if I might have welcomed more help, even though I wasn't openly struggling? My mother's face crumpled slightly. I just assumed you had everything so organized, and Thomas took paternity leave. I did have things organized, I agreed. But that doesn't mean the support wouldn't have been meaningful. It's not just about practical need. It's about feeling equally valued, equally important. Lisa, who had remained standing during this exchange, suddenly sat back down. Her defensive posture had softened slightly, and she was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite empathy, but perhaps the beginning of actual consideration. I never thought about it that way, she admitted quietly. I guess I've always just accepted that Mom and Dad would drop everything for me because they always have. It was the first moment of genuine self-awareness I'd seen from my sister in our entire adult lives, a small crack in the entitled persona she'd cultivated for so long. The beach house, my father said, returning to the immediate issue. We should have asked permission before using it. That was presumptuous of us. It wasn't a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a significant step forward. I nodded, accepting this partial concession. And keeping a copy of the key without telling you, my mother added. That was wrong. I see that now. Thank you for acknowledging that, I said. That means a lot to me. Thomas shifted beside me, his hand still reassuringly close to mine. Since we're trying to establish a healthier pattern going forward, maybe we could discuss the beach house issue specifically. Eleanor and I have our own plans for using it this summer, including a 2-week family vacation in August that's non-negotiable. But there might be other weeks when Lisa's family could use it, with proper arrangements and expectations. His practical suggestion helped redirect the conversation from the emotional minefield of past hurts to the concrete problem at hand. I shot him a grateful look. That seems reasonable, my father said, nodding slowly. Lisa, would that work for you and the children? Using the house for specific weeks rather than the entire summer? Lisa hesitated, clearly still struggling with not getting exactly what she'd initially wanted. I guess I'd need to know which weeks, to see if it works with Ryan's schedule and the kids' summer camps. We can look at our calendar and let you know our availability, I offered. And if you do use the house, we'd expect you to treat it with respect. Clean up after yourselves, follow the house rules we've established, and leave it as you found it. Of course, Lisa said, a slight edge returning to her voice. We're not animals, Eleanor. I chose to ignore the tone and focus on the content, an agreement to basic expectations. Progress, however small. There's one more thing, I said, meeting each of their gazes in turn. This isn't just about the beach house. It's about how we relate to each other going forward. I need all of you to understand that my boundaries are valid, my needs matter, and my property is mine to control. That doesn't mean I won't be generous or helpful. It just means that my generosity needs to be freely given, not assumed or demanded. My mother nodded slowly. I think we can try to be more mindful of that. And, I continued, feeling bolder, I'd like some acknowledgement that the family dynamic has been unbalanced. Lisa has received more support, more attention, more accommodation than I have over the years. Not because she's more loved, perhaps, but because she's been perceived as needier. This was pushing further than I'd dared before, asking not just for changed behavior going forward, but for recognition of past patterns. It was a risk, but one I needed to take for true healing to begin. Lisa's face flushed. This isn't a competition, Eleanor. No, it's not, I agreed. Which is why it's hurtful when one child consistently receives more than the other. It shouldn't be a competition, but it has felt like one where the outcome was predetermined. You would always get more because you were seen as needing more. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Eleanor, family dynamics are complex. Different children have different needs at different times. Yes, I said, refusing to be deflected. But when one child consistently gets more across decades, across all life stages and situations, it stops being about different needs and starts being about different values. Can you understand why that would be hurtful? My directness seemed to unsettle him. He removed his glasses and polished them with his handkerchief, a nervous habit I recognized from childhood. I suppose I can see how it might appear that way from your perspective. It wasn't the full acknowledgement I'd hoped for, but it was something, a crack in the facade of family mythology that had portrayed our unequal treatment as natural and justified. The conversation continued for another hour, circling through old hurts, current grievances, tentative acknowledgments, and fragile agreements. There were moments of connection and moments of frustration. By the time my parents and Lisa finally rose to leave, we had reached an uneasy truce rather than a true resolution. As they stood in the hallway, preparing to depart, my mother turned to me with an uncertain smile. Will you and Thomas and Abigail still come to Sunday dinner next week? It would mean a lot to us. The invitation was an olive branch, a way of saying that despite this difficult conversation, they wanted to maintain our relationship. I glanced at Thomas, who gave a slight nod of support. Yes, I said finally. We'll be there. But Mom, Dad, this conversation isn't over. We've taken a first step today, but there's more work to be done if we want to build a healthier relationship going forward. My father nodded gravely. We understand, Eleanor. We'll try to do better. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was a beginning. After my family left, Thomas and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The emotional weight of the confrontation had left us both drained. Finally, he reached over and took my hand. You did it, he said softly. You stood your ground, without losing your composure. I'm proud of you. I leaned my head against his shoulder, allowing the tension to slowly release from my body. Do you think anything will actually change? Hard to say, Thomas replied thoughtfully. Your parents seemed genuinely surprised by some of what you said, like they'd never considered those perspectives before. That could lead to real change. Or they could fall back into old patterns as soon as the shock wears off, I added. Possibly, he conceded. But even if they do, you've changed. You've drawn a clear line that they now know you won't let them cross. That matters, regardless of whether they fully understand or accept it. I nodded against his shoulder, too emotionally exhausted to analyze further. I need to pick up Abigail soon. I'll go, Thomas offered. You should rest, process. We can talk more later if you want. After he left, I moved through the house in a daze, straightening the living room, putting away the untouched cookies and tea. My mind kept replaying fragments of the conversation, searching for clues about what it all meant for our future family dynamics. Had I been too harsh? Not firm enough? Had I finally gotten through to them? Or had I only confirmed their view of me as suddenly selfish and difficult? By the time Thomas returned with an excited Abigail, eager to tell me about her playdate, I had settled into a state of cautious hope. Something had shifted today, perhaps not as dramatically or definitively as I might have wished, but a real shift nonetheless. The unspoken rules that had governed our family for decades had finally been named, questioned, challenged. There was no going back to the way things were before, even if the path forward remained unclear. The next few weeks brought small, tentative changes in my family's behavior. My mother called to check on Abigail's upcoming dance recital, something she had rarely shown interest in before. My father emailed me an article related to my work, with a brief note saying it had made him think of me. These were tiny gestures, but they felt significant. Conscious efforts to demonstrate that I mattered, that my life and interests were worthy of attention. Lisa was more complicated. She maintained a cool distance, responding to my texts about possible beach house scheduling with brief, business-like messages. She was clearly still processing her role in the family dynamic I had called out, perhaps for the first time recognizing how she had benefited from the imbalance and grappling with what that meant about her own sense of entitlement. Give her time, Aunt Carol advised when I called to update her. Lisa's entire identity has been built around being the one who needs more, gets more, deserves more. That's not easy to re-examine, especially when it means facing her own complicity in how you've been treated. I'm not looking for a dramatic transformation, I assured her. Just some basic respect for my boundaries and acknowledgement of the pattern. Well, the beach house situation will be the real test, won't it? Carol observed wisely. That's where all this started. How they handle that going forward will tell you a lot about whether anything has truly changed. She was right, of course. The beach house had become more than just a property. It was now the symbolic battleground for our family's realignment. Would my parents and Lisa honor the new boundaries I had established? Or would old entitlement patterns reassert themselves when the emotional intensity of our confrontation had faded? I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 weeks after our family meeting, I received a call from my mother. "Eleanor," she began, her voice carrying that familiar hesitant tone that usually preceded a request. "I was wondering if we could talk about the beach house again." I tensed immediately, bracing myself for another boundary push. "What about it?" "Well, Lisa and I have been looking at the family calendar, and we were hoping to identify some specific weeks that might work for her family to use it. You mentioned that might be possible." The fact that she was asking rather than assuming was a small but meaningful change. "Yes, that's right. Thomas and I have our own plans for several weekends in the first 2 weeks of August, but there might be other times that would work." "That's wonderful," my mother said, relief evident in her voice. "I was thinking maybe the last 2 weeks of July? The children's summer camps end then, and it would give them a nice vacation before school preparations begin in August." I checked our calendar. We had tentatively planned to spend the last weekend of July at the beach house ourselves, but the timing wasn't critical. "The first week of July would work better for us," I replied. "We were planning to be there the last weekend of July." There was a moment of silence, and I could almost hear my mother calculating whether to push for her preference or accept mine. In the past, there would have been no question. I would have been expected to adjust my plans to accommodate Lisa's. "I'll check with Lisa about the first week of July," she said finally. "That might actually work better with Ryan's schedule anyway." The simple act of accepting my preference without argument felt revolutionary. I found myself momentarily speechless. "And, Eleanor," my mother continued, her voice softening, "your father and I have been talking a lot about what you said, about feeling less valued over the years. I want you to know that was never our intention. We love you deeply." "I know you love me, Mom," I said gently. But sometimes love gets expressed unevenly in families, especially when one child seems to need more attention or help than the other, she sighed. "Yes, I think that's what happened. We became so accustomed to Lisa's, let's call it greater expressiveness about her needs, that we stopped even considering whether you might have similar needs that you weren't expressing quite so forcefully." It was the most direct acknowledgement she had ever made of the family dynamic. Not a full reckoning, perhaps, but a genuine recognition that the pattern I had named was real. "That means a lot to me, Mom," I said, emotion thickening my voice unexpectedly. All I've ever wanted was equal consideration. Not more than Lisa, just not consistently less. "We're trying to be more mindful of that," she assured me. "It's not easy to change patterns that have been in place for so long, but your father and I are committed to doing better." After we hung up, I sat at my desk, turning the conversation over in my mind. The changes were subtle but significant, asking rather than assuming, accepting my preference without argument, acknowledging the pattern that had hurt me. Small steps, perhaps, but in the right direction. Later that evening, I received a text from Lisa. "Mom said the first week of July works for the beach house. I wanted to ask, are there any special rules or instructions we should know about? I want to make sure we respect your property." I stared at the message in mild shock. Not only was she accepting the time frame I had offered, but she was explicitly acknowledging my ownership and asking how to respect it. From Lisa, this was nothing short of revolutionary. "I'll put together a short guide to the house," I responded. "Basic things like how the heating works, where the circuit breaker is, local emergency numbers, nothing complicated." "Thanks," she replied. "And Eleanor, I've been thinking about what you said, about how I've always gotten more support than you. I don't think I ever really saw it before." It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, the beginning of a new awareness that might, in time, lead to genuine change in our relationship. "That means a lot to me, Lisa," I typed back. "I'm not looking to change everything overnight, just for a little more balance and respect going forward." "I can try for that," she replied simply. As I set down my phone, I felt a cautious optimism blooming. The beach house, that tangible symbol of my boundaries and independence, had somehow become the catalyst for a subtle but meaningful shift in our family dynamics. Old patterns were being questioned, new expectations established. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation. There would be setbacks, moments of regression, old habits reasserting themselves, but something fundamental had changed. I had changed, first and foremost, finding the courage to demand the respect and consideration I deserved. And perhaps, just perhaps, my family was beginning to change too. The first week of July arrived with surprising swiftness. True to my word, I had prepared a detailed guide to the beach house for Lisa's family. Everything from the quirks of the old water heater to the best local spots for ice cream and seafood. Thomas and I had spent the weekend before their arrival, deep cleaning the house, stocking basic supplies, and making sure everything was in perfect order. "You don't have to go to so much trouble," Thomas had remarked as I meticulously arranged fresh flowers in the guest bedrooms. "They're unlikely to do the same for us." "I know," I replied, adjusting a sunflower. "But this isn't about reciprocity. It's about setting the standard for how I want my property to be treated and showing that boundaries don't mean I can't also be generous." On the day Lisa and her family were scheduled to arrive, I found myself unexpectedly nervous. This would be the first real test of our new family dynamic, whether the respect and boundaries we had discussed would translate into action. "Do you want me to drive out there with you to hand over the keys?" Thomas offered as I checked my beach house to-do list for the third time. I considered this briefly. Having Thomas there would provide emotional support, but it might also send the message that I didn't trust Lisa to handle the exchange responsibly. I think I need to do this myself, I decided. It's an opportunity to establish our new normal one-on-one. The drive to Cannon Beach was pleasant, the summer day clear and warm. As I rounded the final bend and the house came into view, I saw Lisa's SUV already parked in the driveway. She was standing on the porch, the twins exploring the front garden, while Ryan unloaded luggage from the car. Sophia, the oldest at 12, sat on the porch steps, absorbed in her phone. I parked behind their vehicle and took a deep breath before stepping out. This wasn't just a key handover. It was the first real test of whether our confrontation had led to meaningful change. "Eleanor!" Lisa called, waving with unexpected warmth. "We just got here a few minutes ago. Hope that's okay?" "Perfect timing," I replied, retrieving a folder from my passenger seat. "I've got the keys and house guide for you." The twins, Max and Emma, bounded over, their initial shyness quickly overcome by excitement. "Aunt Eleanor, is it true you have a secret path to the beach?" Max asked, bouncing on his toes. "Do you really have a telescope for watching whales?" Emma added, not waiting for an answer to her brother's question. I couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. "The path isn't exactly secret, but it is private. Just through those trees beyond the back deck. And yes, there's a telescope on the upper balcony. You might see some gray whales if you're lucky." Ryan approached, extending his hand. "Eleanor, thanks for this. The kids have been talking about nothing else for weeks." His sincere gratitude took me by surprise. Ryan had always been pleasant, but somewhat distant in our interactions, orbiting the periphery of family dynamics without directly engaging. "You're welcome," I said, shaking his hand. "I hope you all have a wonderful week here." Lisa joined us, her expression more tentative than I was used to seeing. "We really appreciate this, Eleanor. I know things have been complicated lately." "Water under the bridge," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. The past couldn't be erased, but perhaps it could be a foundation for something healthier going forward. I handed her the folder containing the house keys, alarm code, and the detailed guide I had prepared. "Everything you should need is in here. There's a list of emergency contacts, including the local property manager who can help if anything goes wrong." Lisa leafed through the pages, nodding appreciatively. "This is incredibly thorough. Thank you." "I've also stocked some basics in the pantry and refrigerator," I added. "Nothing elaborate, just enough to get you through the first day until you can grocery shop." Lisa looked up, genuine surprise in her eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," I said simply. And I realized that was true. Despite our complicated history, despite the hurt and resentment that had built over years, I did want them to enjoy the beach house, to create their own happy memories here. My boundaries weren't about withholding. They were about ensuring that my generosity was a choice rather than an expectation. Lisa hesitated, then said, "The kids made you something, to say thank you." She turned toward the porch. "Sophia, can you bring Aunt Eleanor the gift?" Sophia, looking slightly embarrassed as only pre-teens can, approached with a large, flat package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "We all worked on it," she mumbled, handing it to me. Touched by the unexpected gesture, I carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a beautifully framed collage of beach-themed artwork, Emma's watercolor seashells, Max's crayon drawing of waves, and Sophia's surprisingly sophisticated pencil sketch of Haystack Rock. In the center, Lisa had written in elegant calligraphy, "Thank you for sharing your special place with us." For a moment, I couldn't speak, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "This is beautiful," I finally managed. "I'll hang it in the house so all our guests can appreciate it." "Really?" Emma asked, her small face lighting up. "Absolutely," I assured her. "Artists should have their work displayed." As I prepared to leave, Lisa walked me back to my car. Away from the children and Ryan, her expression grew more serious. Eleanor, I've been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation about how things have been between us. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. I don't think I ever really saw it before, how Mom and Dad treated us differently, how I benefited from that. It was just normal to me. She looked down, tracing a pattern in the gravel with her toe. And I think maybe I leaned into it, took advantage of it. Her self-awareness caught me off guard. It's a hard pattern to recognize when you're in it, I offered. Especially when it works in your favor. Still, she said, meeting my eyes directly. I'm sorry. Not just for the beach house thing, but for all of it. For never questioning why I always got more help, more attention. For expecting it to continue indefinitely. It was the apology I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. Not comprehensive or perfect, but sincere in its acknowledgement of the dynamic that had shaped our relationship for decades. Thank you, I said simply. That means a lot. As I drove away, glancing in my rearview mirror at Lisa and her family already exploring the beach path, I felt an unexpected lightness. The beach house, my beach house, had somehow become the catalyst for a transformation that extended far beyond property rights. It had forced a reckoning with family patterns that had gone unquestioned for too long, had created space for new understanding and respect to emerge. I called Thomas as I merged onto the highway. How did it go? He asked immediately. Surprisingly, well, I replied. They were respectful, appreciative. The kids made me a beautiful thank you gift. And Lisa? Lisa actually apologized. Wow, Thomas said, genuine surprise in his voice. That's unexpected. I know, I agreed. It feels like something fundamental has shifted. Not dramatically, not completely, but meaningfully. I'm glad, he said warmly. You deserve that acknowledgement. When I arrived home, I found a text from my mother. Lisa just sent me a photo of the kids on your beach. They look so happy. Thank you for your generosity, Eleanor. Your father and I have been talking about how we can be more equitable going forward. Would you be open to discussing this when you come for dinner on Sunday? I smiled at the message. Another small indication that our family confrontation had sparked genuine reflection. I'd like that, I texted back, looking forward to it. That night, as Abigail snuggled against me during her bedtime story, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past few months. What had begun as a simple boundary assertion, my right to control access to my own property, had evolved into something far more profound. A renegotiation of my place within my family, a reclamation of my worth and importance, a refusal to accept less than I deserved. Mommy? Abigail asked sleepily as I finished the story. Can we go to the beach house next weekend? Not next weekend, sweetie, I explained gently. Aunt Lisa and her family are using it right now, but we'll go for 2 whole weeks in August, remember? She nodded, her eyelids growing heavy. I like that Aunt Lisa can use our house too. Sharing is good. Yes, it is, I agreed, kissing her forehead. Sharing by choice is very good. It's one of the best things we can do. But it's also good to remember that we get to choose when and how to share what's ours. Like my special Teddy? She murmured, already half asleep. I share him sometimes, but he's still my Teddy. Exactly like that, I whispered, marveling at the wisdom that sometimes emerged from my child's simple perspective. Exactly like that. As I tiptoed from her room, I realized that the lesson I had fought so hard to establish with my parents and sister was one I wanted Abigail to understand from the beginning. That generosity and boundaries weren't opposing forces, but complementary ones. That she could be both kind and firm, both giving and self-respecting. That her worth wasn't measured by how much she sacrificed for others, but by how authentically she lived her values. The beach house stood as a physical embodiment of that lesson now, a place where I had finally drawn a line, demanded respect, and in doing so, paradoxically created space for a healthier, more balanced kind of sharing to emerge. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Old patterns had a way of reasserting themselves, and I harbored no illusions that one confrontation had permanently transformed decades of family dynamics. But something fundamental had changed, beginning with me. I had found my voice, established my boundaries, and demanded the respect I deserved. And in that act of self-advocacy, I had perhaps given my family the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to know and relate to the real me, not the accommodating shadow I had allowed myself to become. That was a foundation on which something new and better could be built. Something balanced, respectful, and authentic. The beach house was still mine, but now it was also so much more. A symbol of my transformation, a touchstone for our family's new beginning, and a legacy of self-respect that I could pass on to my daughter. 3 months passed. Summer transitioned to fall, bringing crisp mornings and golden afternoons to Seattle. The beach house visit had gone remarkably well. Lisa and her family had left the property immaculate, even fixing a loose railing on the back deck that Ryan had noticed. They'd sent photos of the children building sandcastles and exploring tide pools, genuine joy evident in their expressions. The artwork they'd given me now hung proudly in the beach house living room, a visible reminder of our family's tentative steps toward healing. The Sunday dinner my mother had mentioned proved to be a turning point. My parents had prepared thoughtfully, creating space for an honest conversation about family patterns and future expectations. There had been uncomfortable moments, of course. Old habits and perceptions don't dissolve overnight. But there had also been genuine listening, acknowledgement, and commitment to change. "We've been doing some research," my father had said, surprising me with a stack of books on family dynamics and favoritism. "We want to understand how we got here, to make sure we don't keep repeating the same mistakes." Their efforts weren't perfect, but they were sincere. My mother had started reaching out more consistently about Abigail's activities. My father had begun sharing articles and thoughts about my professional interests, and both had become noticeably more mindful about balancing their attention and support between Lisa and me. Even more surprisingly, Lisa had maintained her newfound self-awareness, reaching out occasionally with genuinely thoughtful texts or calls, making efforts to acknowledge my boundaries and express appreciation for my willingness to share the beach house. Our relationship remained somewhat tentative, but there was a new foundation of mutual respect that hadn't existed before. I was reflecting on these changes one crisp October morning, nursing a cup of coffee at my kitchen table while reviewing quarterly financial reports for work, when my phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen. "Dad? Everything okay?" I answered, a slight edge of concern in my voice. My father rarely called during weekday mornings, knowing I was usually busy with work. "Eleanor." His voice sounded strained, unusual for his typically composed demeanor. "I need to talk to you about something important. Are you free to meet for lunch today?" "I can make time," I said, already mentally rearranging my afternoon schedule. "Is everyone all right? Mom? Lisa?" "Everyone's healthy," he assured me quickly. "It's not that kind of emergency, it's—" He hesitated, which was unlike him. My father, the university professor, was rarely at a loss for words. "It's about the house, our house. Your mother and I need to make some difficult decisions, and I'd value your input." "Of course," I replied, curiosity piqued. "The cafe near your department at noon?" "Perfect," he said, sounding relieved. "Thank you, Eleanor." After we hung up, I sat pondering the call. My parents had lived in the same colonial-style house in Seattle's Ravenna neighborhood for over 30 years. It was the house where Lisa and I had grown up, a spacious 4-bedroom with a generous yard and character-filled nooks and crannies. They'd often talked about eventually downsizing, but had never taken concrete steps in that direction. At noon, I found my father already seated at our usual table in the corner of the university cafe, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. "Dad," I greeted him, leaning down to kiss his cheek before taking my seat. "What's going on?" He sighed deeply, pushing his barely touched lunch aside. "The university's pension fund has been mismanaged," he began without preamble. "The details are complex and frankly infuriating, but the bottom line is that the retirement benefits your mother and I were counting on have been significantly reduced. We're looking at about 60% of what we'd planned for." "That's awful," I said, genuinely concerned. My parents had always been financially prudent but not wealthy. Both had dedicated their careers to academia, prioritizing intellectual fulfillment over maximum earning potential. "Is there any legal recourse? A class action from affected faculty?" "That's in process," he nodded. "But these things take years, and even if successful, won't likely restore the full amount. We need to adjust our plans now, not wait for an uncertain outcome." "And this relates to the house?" I prompted gently. "Yes," he confirmed, meeting my eyes directly. "We've been consulting with a financial advisor. Given our revised retirement outlook, keeping the house no longer makes financial sense. It's too large for just the two of us. The maintenance costs increase every year, and it's our most significant asset. The advisor recommends selling and using the proceeds to purchase a smaller, more manageable property, investing the difference to supplement our reduced pension." I nodded, understanding the logic. "That seems sensible. Have you started looking at smaller homes or condos?" "That's part of what I wanted to discuss with you," he said, his expression growing more uncertain. "Your mother is struggling with the idea of leaving the family home. She's emotionally attached to it, understandably. We raised our children there, hosted countless gatherings, and built a life within those walls." "I can imagine it's difficult," I acknowledged, remembering how much my mother loved that house, how she'd cultivated the garden over decades, chosen each paint color with careful deliberation, and filled every room with memories. "But surely, she understands the financial necessity?" "She does, intellectually," he replied. "But emotionally, it's harder. Which brings me to why I wanted to talk with you specifically." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Your mother has suggested an alternative that involves your beach house." I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, an instinctive wariness born from decades of having my boundaries tested. "My beach house?" I repeated carefully. "She's wondering if we might use it as a transitional solution," he explained, choosing his words with obvious care. "Perhaps stay there for extended periods while we sort out our next steps. It would give us breathing room to make decisions without feeling rushed, and allow your mother time to process leaving the family home." I remained silent, processing his words and my own complex reaction to them. Part of me immediately wanted to help my parents during this difficult time. Another part felt the old familiar pressure, the expectation that my resources would naturally be redirected to family needs, my boundaries flexible where others were not. "I want to be clear," my father continued, evidently sensing my hesitation. "This is a request, not an expectation. We recognize that the beach house is your property, purchased with your earnings, and you have every right to decline. I insisted on speaking with you directly rather than having your mother call, because I wanted to make sure you understood that we respect your right to say no." His explicit acknowledgement of my ownership and boundaries was new, evidence of the shift in our family dynamic over recent months. It allowed me to consider the request on its merits rather than as part of an old pattern of obligation and acquiescence. "How long a stay are you envisioning?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Potentially several months," he admitted. "The housing market is strongest in spring, so ideally we'd list the house then. We'd need time before that to sort through decades of accumulation, make any necessary repairs or updates. And after selling, we'd need time to find and secure a new home. I took a deep breath, considering the implications. Several months of my parents living in my beach house would significantly impact our own ability to use it. It would mean adjusting plans, possibly disappointing Abigail, who loved our weekend getaways to the coast. Yet I could also see how it might be exactly the buffer my parents needed during a challenging transition. I'd need to discuss this with Thomas, I said finally, and there would need to be clear parameters, specific timeframes, expectations, about maintenance and expenses, respect for our own occasional need to use the property. Of course, my father agreed quickly. We wouldn't expect otherwise, and we would insist on contributing utilities, maintenance costs, perhaps even a modest rent. His willingness to acknowledge the financial implications of their request, rather than assuming family obligations superseded such considerations, was another small but significant shift from old patterns. "There's one more thing," I added, meeting his gaze directly. "I need to know if you've suggested this to Lisa as well. Does she know you're asking to use my beach house? Has she offered any alternative support?" My father's expression shifted. Slightly, a shadow of discomfort crossing his features. "We haven't discussed it with Lisa yet. Your mother thought—" He paused, then seemed to reconsider his words. "I'll be honest, Eleanor. Your mother initially assumed your beach house would be the solution, without considering whether Lisa might also have resources to offer. That's part of the old pattern, isn't it? Expecting accommodation from you, not from Lisa." His insight surprised me. The recognition of the very dynamic I had named months ago, now identified by my father himself. When I pointed this out, he continued, "Your mother realized we needed to approach this differently. That's why I'm talking to you first, being transparent about the request and explicit about your right to decline. We plan to have a similar conversation with Lisa about other ways she might support us during this transition." I nodded, genuinely appreciative of his self-awareness. "Thank you for recognizing that, Dad. It means a lot." "We're trying," he said, simply. "We don't always get it right, but we're trying." As I drove back to my office after lunch, I turned our conversation over in my mind. My parents' request was significant. Multiple months in my beach house was no small accommodation. Yet the way they had asked, with explicit recognition of my boundaries and ownership, with no attempt at manipulation or guilt, was dramatically different from how such requests would have been framed in the past. The beach house, once again, had become the testing ground for our family's evolving dynamics. But this time, I faced the test with a new strength, secure in my right to consider the request on my own terms, to consult with Thomas, to weigh our family's needs alongside my parents' request. Whatever decision we made would be mine, not extracted through guilt or obligation, but freely given after thoughtful consideration. And that, perhaps, was the most meaningful change of all. That evening, I sat with Thomas on our back deck, watching Abigail play with her neighborhood friends in the yard. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke as I recounted my conversation with my father. "So they want to use the beach house as a transition space while they sell their home," Thomas summarized when I finished. "For potentially several months." I nodded, wrapping my hands around a mug of tea. "It's a significant request. We'd need to adjust our own plans for the property." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "What are you thinking?" "My sense is you're torn." "I am," I admitted. "Part of me wants to help them through this difficult transition. Another part worries about falling back into old patterns, my needs and preferences taking a back seat to family demands." "But this feels different from previous situations, doesn't it?" Thomas observed. "Your father approached it as a genuine request, not an expectation. He acknowledged your right to say no. That's progress." "It is," I agreed. "And they've been making consistent efforts to address the imbalances I pointed out. Small things, but meaningful." We talked for nearly an hour, weighing options, considering implications, and discussing potential parameters. By the time we called Abigail in for dinner, we had reached a tentative decision. The next morning, I called my father. "I've discussed your request with Thomas," I began. "We're open to having you use the beach house, with some specific conditions." The relief in my father's voice was audible. "Thank you, Eleanor. We're grateful for your consideration. What conditions did you have in mind?" "First, a clear time frame. We can commit to making the house available to you from January through May. That should give you time to prepare your house for the spring market and begin your search for a new home." "That seems very reasonable," he agreed. "Second, we'd still like to use the property occasionally during that period, perhaps one weekend each month. We'd coordinate with you in advance." "Of course, it's your home, after all." "Third, we'd need to formalize the financial arrangements. You'll cover all utilities during your stay, plus a modest rent that reflects the market value. I've researched comparable vacation rentals in the area, and I'm proposing half the going rate, which seems fair given the family relationship." There was a brief pause. In the past, suggesting that my parents pay for using the beach house might have triggered defensiveness or accusations of being mercenary. Instead, my father simply said, "That's more than fair. We'll draw up an agreement to make everything clear." "One more thing," I added. "Have you spoken with Lisa about other ways she might support you during this transition?" "We had dinner with her and Ryan last night," he confirmed. "They've offered to help with sorting and packing the house, and to store some of our belongings in their basement while we're between homes. Ryan also has a contact in real estate who's willing to list the house at a reduced commission." I felt a wave of satisfaction. My parents had actually followed through on approaching Lisa for help as well, breaking the old pattern of expecting accommodation only from me. "That sounds like good support," I said sincerely. "I'm glad they're helping too." After finalizing details with my father, I found myself reflecting on the journey our family had taken over the past 6 months. What had begun with a presumptuous text message about my beach house had evolved into a profound renegotiation of family dynamics. Boundaries had been established, patterns named and challenged, new expectations set. The beach house, that tangible symbol of my independence and success, had become the catalyst for transformation. First as the subject of conflict, then as a testing ground for new boundaries, and now as a genuine gift I could choose to share from a position of strength rather than obligation. In January, Thomas, Abigail, and I helped my parents settle into the beach house. My mother moved through the rooms with appreciative eyes, running her hand over the weathered blue kitchen cabinets, admiring the view of Haystack Rock from the living room windows. "You've created something beautiful here, Eleanor," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Thank you for sharing it with us during this difficult time." "You're welcome," I replied simply, accepting her gratitude without deflection or discomfort. Over the following months, we established a new rhythm. My parents used the beach house as their temporary home, gradually coming to terms with leaving their family house behind. Thomas, Abigail, and I visited one weekend each month, enjoying our property while respecting my parents' temporary residency. To my surprise, these visits became opportunities for deeper connection. Unhurried meals together, long walks on the beach, evenings spent playing board games while listening to the ocean's rhythm. Lisa and her family joined us for one of these weekends in April. As the children played on the beach below, the adults gathered on the deck, enjoying the strengthening spring sunshine. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened since last summer," Lisa said, unexpectedly breaking a comfortable silence. "How different things might have been if Eleanor hadn't stood her ground about the beach house." My father nodded, thoughtfully. "We might never have recognized patterns that needed changing." "I'm still working on it," my mother admitted. "Sometimes I catch myself falling back into old expectations. But I'm trying to be more conscious, more fair in how I think about both my daughters." We all are, Lisa added, meeting my eyes with a newfound understanding. I never realized how much I benefited from being the needy one. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge, but important. As I looked around at my family, imperfect, evolving, but genuinely trying, I felt a deep sense of peace. The beach house had given me more than just a vacation property. It had given me the catalyst to reclaim my worth within my family, to demand the respect I deserved, to transform decades of imbalance into something healthier and more equitable. My parents sold their house in May, finding a charming craftsman bungalow closer to the university that delighted my mother with its built-ins and garden potential. They moved out of the beach house with genuine gratitude, leaving it immaculate and even paying to have the exterior painted as a thank you gesture. On Memorial Day weekend, Thomas, Abigail, and I returned to our beach house, now truly ours again. As I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint Haystack Rock in golden hues, I reflected on the journey we'd taken. The text message that had started it all, "We love your sister's children more," had never been spoken in those exact words. But the sentiment had shaped our family dynamics for decades, an unspoken truth that had diminished my worth and distorted our relationships. Naming that truth had been painful but necessary. Challenging it had required courage I hadn't known I possessed. But the result, a family slowly healing, relationships recalibrating toward greater balance and respect, had been worth every difficult conversation, every uncomfortable confrontation. The beach house stood as both witness and catalyst to this transformation. More than just wood and glass and ocean views, it had become the ground where I had finally claimed my equal place in my family's heart. As Thomas joined me on the porch, slipping his arm around my shoulders, I leaned into his embrace, watching the fading light dance across the water. Some battles were worth fighting, not for victory, but for truth. Some boundaries worth establishing, not for separation, but for healthier connection. I had fought for mine, and in doing so had helped create something new and better for us all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.